What up, y'all? I'm Dr. CBS here with my girl, Dr. Layla Brown, and you're tuned into season 2, episode 17 of The Last Dope Intellectual. And we want to note that this is a very special 2-part episode where we will be focusing on radical Black women, featuring the very special guests, Dev and Darian, the co-hosts of the Groundings podcast. All right, y'all. So before we get into our shoot the shit for this week, let me go ahead and read off our patrons. So we got Abel Gatacho, we got Stephen Osuna, and we have Kyle Walker Hackshaw. So thank y'all so much for allowing us to pay the bills and most importantly, to pay our producer. All right, y'all. So we have a very long, robust episode. So we want to keep our shoot the shit short and sweet. But part of what we're thinking about is collaboration because we have some very special sort of co-hosts, co-anchors for this episode. And so one of the questions is like, how do we think about or how do we decide who to collaborate with? What makes a good collaboration, because we do this in all sorts of different capacities. Sometimes it's like organizations that link up, obviously me and you, us three collaborate every week. Layla, we collaborate in sort of putting together the episodes. So, and Two Black too, actually. So like, just thinking about collaborations, what do y'all got?
I mean, you're way better at me than making connections with people. But for me, obviously, collaboration is two things. Hopefully those two come together, but it's at least one of two things. One is either a shared politics or a vision for a thing, and it's a particular kind of interaction. Like one of the things that I think works about LDI in general is that I think we essentially share our most important politics, but also that we're friends. And I think, I say this all the time. I don't envision doing LDI differently with another. Like, I think that there is something both about our own intellectual, historical, political commitments and trajectory, but also our friendship and the way that allows us to interact. And so for me, collaborations, it's either we're coming together to achieve a particular end, or it has to be otherwise it has to be enjoyable. Like sometimes political shit is not enjoyable, but it's got to be one of those two. It's got to achieve a particular end, or it's got to be something I'm going to enjoy doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess most things are, I guess for me, are at least collective. Maybe not collaborative, but they're collective anyway. So really everything is in a literal sense that you don't even get on Zoom if somebody doesn't have an algorithm. Somebody has to make a mic. Like all of these things require collective people to do things. So collaboration is just like more so like more being more intentional about the fact that we already have connections to each other. So it's like I don't know, as an artist, having done shows with people who whether like I was just thinking the other day about the show we did was like a dedication to Gil Scott Heron or so, and how we had to bring a bunch of different artists together, have to memorize poems or memorize songs, and then you have the musicians that have to memorize the music, and sometimes we may not even get to practice maybe once or twice. So everybody's got to like go to their separate space and figure those things out, and then come together and make sure we iron it out at practice. And then we got to go do this at a show where there might be hundreds of people. But sometimes those are the most fulfilling shows. Like it's a lot to do a show by yourself, but sometimes like when you just know you can show up and play your part, and then other people can bounce off of that, like that's dope. But even when it is something that might be centered on, like even if it was just me or if, whatever, or if something y'all do, you still need like other people in the background. So that's what I'm saying. Like everything is like collaborative. Like even if it was a show that I do, if I have a band or something, I still got to work with them. We still have to establish an understanding. For me, I just think more so about that since that's kind of the background that I have. But even doing stuff like this, I guess like we always have to read somebody else's work. We always have to like understand what they're talking about so we can even have a good dialogue, even if we don't agree. And then we have to always be open to that part that we can't necessarily quantify, whether you want to call it a mystery, a gray area, whatever. You always have to be open to that part, actually like playing out and hoping it goes well when you really just don't know. But that's also part of collaboration too.
Yeah, so it's like a combination of having like a game plan. Y'all know quite rigid. I have to have at least have to have a framework to push against. I do not do well when it's just like whatever, you know what I mean? But there is a level of both improvisation, but also kind of like being willing to pivot in real time when things come up. And that's something that I think that we actually do quite well on LDI. Like this shoot the shit. Two Black literally rolled out of bed, as you can see, and just hopped on, and we just chopping it up, and it works, But we have the framework.
It's literally right behind me. Yeah.
We have the framework, like we're gonna shoot the shit about something, right? But but were we expecting, the ashy voice? No, right? But we roll with it. We roll with it, and we just make it happen, But on a more serious note, I think that collaboration is important, and the collaboration that we did for this show in particular, because it's kind of like you gotta squad up with people who are like-minded, right? So that you're not crazy, because so often we have to have the conversations with liberals or with people who ain't got no politics whatsoever, but to have conversations with people who are like with the shits and who, again, you're not going to agree on everything, but who you can just vibe with, like that energy is important. You know what I'm saying? Even like when you're thinking about how organizations get together around a particular campaign, again, it's kind of like, you don't have to always share the same exact ideology or mission statement or whatever, but it's like when you get that energy and people who are dedicated to a particular issue, to a particular theme, to a campaign, to a struggle, that's affirming, and it's like fortifying, because the struggle is long, and even though we're just having conversations, it's still important, because you don't you start from the base level. It's like, I don't have to prove that I'm correct. Like we already have a common sort of a shared goal or a shared purpose, and so I think that that's important too.
I think the last thing for me though, which I appreciate, I mean, CBS, you and I met in 2019. And I think outside of, if you're an academic, whatever, you spend some time in the classroom through your graduate program, but then you spend a lot of time on your own writing. And I think this has been our collaboration in general, not just on LDI, but together as friends, whatever other things that we do. It has been one of the friendships that I've learned the most from. And like, I'm always happy about engaging with LDI, the guests that we choose, Two Black, because selfishly, how it allows me to grow, right? And so I think that there's always that the collaboration, I think, is both about what you produce and what you're able to gain from it. And for me, I find no pleasure, enjoyment, and really I struggle with any kind of work that requires me to be completely alone. I always find that it's necessary to talk out my ideas. Like, a lot of people talk about, we've talked about this where a lot of people talk about how they think through writing. And that's just not one of the ways that I engage. Like having this conversation that will be featured in the rest of the episode, learning so much from Devin Darian, like that for me is just, it is one of the ways that I feel like, as much as I am a teacher, I want to continue to be a lifelong learner, and collaboration is one of the ways that I think I engage in learning in the most substantive ways.
I was going to say, I think I have an interesting contradiction as a socialist, because I'm quite misanthropic, and I hated group work. I still hate group work. Like but I think that collaborating gives me or teaches me those skills and allows me to find sort of joy, or at least appreciation for having to work with others and listen to ideas. It's not that I don't like listening, but it's like, or like having your vision subsumed to another vision or a collective vision. Like those are actually skills, and like doing it over time helps me to become more comfortable with it. It's not something that I love, like I'll ever be like, this is going to be my first choice. But I think that, like you, Layla, I've grown through doing it every week. And it's it's 100% easier with somebody I love and respect, right? With people who I trust their ideas, even if I don't necessarily agree with them, I trust that they're in the best interest of the people, that sort of thing. It's much harder when it's with randos or like people, bums or whatever. But like, I will say, like, that is something. So doing this like weekly, and then even sort of thinking about other people to collaborate with, it does allow for a particular development of like social skills, or of like, just of a life skill that doesn't come naturally to me. Yeah.
No, I think that's a good point. I mean, I don't like I'm I'm ambiguous either way. Like I if I like I kind of like what CBS said. If you know what you're doing, I ain't really gonna bother you. Like I can fit in. But if you don't know what the fuck you doing, like I don't do well with that either. Like I don't, we just don't have to do this. So with that being said, I think it's also like it's a good death to the ego sometimes, to have to work with people and work and struggle through things. Like it's just I think it's something I force myself to do, even if I don't necessarily. Now again, like CBS said, if you're a bum, that's different. But if it's just we genuinely don't have maybe the same viewpoints on things, but I can at least tell that you're trying to collaborate on whatever we're doing. I have to try to respect that. I think that's just an important growth personally, and I think that's something that we all, for those of us who claim to be any type of socialist or communist, I think that's something we have to force ourselves to do if we're trying to build that other world. Otherwise, it's just a lot of idealism and liberalism and throwing out a lot of rhetoric, but we're not practicing that. So I think for collaboration, like, sometimes even on this show, I wake up, I see, I check shoot the shit.
Do you
I'm
wake
like,
up?
hmm. Anyway, so I wake up early, check shoot the shit. I don't really, and sometimes I don't probably give away too information, but sometimes that lands on the paper a little late. So, so I have to like, and I always just like,
Most often it lands on the paper late.
yeah,
Literally.
So, I'm a preparation person, so this is something like I can do improv, like I can if you throw me in, but like I prefer preparation, so I always like, okay, what can I go check real quick? But it forces me to have to like work with. But like, think that's a good challenge for me. Like, I'm saying that I appreciate those type of things, those type of collaborative efforts. I mean, that's just one of many. Obviously, editing is its own. That's another conversation as far as like how that looks and how collaborative editing is. Like, literally, like, yo, send me this. Send me the picture. Yo, make sure you cut this out. Like that is editing is a very collaborative process because especially when you're editing something that is primarily like about someone else, you have to listen and understand what they want, and then also think about just based on the experience and skills that I may have, understand like the things that are better maybe for a particular product. Like that's with not just with this show, but with anything. So you always have to be in dialogue and conversation with people.
Yeah,
I don't think I realized you and Sharice were so similarly inclined.
I don't have to have, I do. I have to have advanced notice for shit. Like I do.
And just for people listening, the show is definitely prepared. So I don't want people thinking that we just get on here and, and just start
No, but I think
questions.
that's important because some people have said that, like I mean, not that they don't think that it's prepared, but that the way that it's delivered, I think people feel like they don't see all of the work and the effort that goes into it ahead of time.
Yeah, even though, my jokes, which are hilarious, are extemporaneous, that can make it seem like we just hop on here, but nah, we be planning. But then, there are the sparks of genius that happen here and there. I will just throw that out there.
I so appreciate how you like to give yourself your own flowers.
If not me, who? If not now, when? And so the other thing I will say about Two Black, and about collaboration in general, or what makes this particular collaboration work, is like you are so incredibly patient and responsive. I don't know if anybody knows, like, I don't know if anybody knows my personality, but it's one that requires quite a bit of patience, but also like responsiveness. So if like, we're like, can you fix this? he fixes it. Or if he does like a promo that we're like, he'll pivot the next week. Like, for example, early on, I felt like it was too many promos with me talking. And then I was like, let's feature more of like the guest or even Two Black, Layla. And so now it's never me, which I feel like was an overcorrection. So I'll group chat you about that shit. But, but it was a response to like feedback. And so that's another thing that requires like, a good collaboration requires not only just feedback, but also responsiveness, which also is like, how do you deliver the feedback and like level, like mutual respect, you know what I'm saying? So, and respect for the collaborative process and the collaborative nature of the project.
Yeah, I'll say lastly, and then I'll close. At least I'll be done. I mean, like if we're working, this is the thing that gets on my nerves when people throw out words like solidarity or even collaboration. Sometimes, like, what are you working on? Like, seriously, like, what are you actually trying to get done? Because a lot of times the things that might annoy you are easier to get over when you know, like, you're trying to fix something. Like, so if you send me a message and you're like, this isn't right or whatever, whether I'm annoyed or not, I want to get the show right. So that's my priority, and so anything else is underneath that, and we can address it if it's an issue, but like the goal is to get the show right. And when we're collaborating on stuff, we're doing work. We're trying to get something done, whether that's a campaign, whether that's a show, whatever, an event, getting somebody out of prison, things we can't say on Zoom, whatever it is. Like, we're trying to get something done. We're not simply just vibing. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, we're not just kicking it. So like, when people throw out these words about like, we gotta be in solidarity and we gotta be allies and all of this shit, like, what are you working on? Because if you're not really working on anything, then there's not a lot of collaboration. There's not much solidarity because you're not doing anything. And I mean, it's just, that's just how I feel about it. Like, I think what keeps us on, for the most part, is that we are working on something. So there's a shared vision. And then if that falls apart, fine. But at least we know, like, okay, this is what we're trying to get done. And we can debate on what it looks like or how it should be, but that's still like something we can struggle together. That gives people, and I'm saying this to say, it gives people a common ground, even when they don't agree on everything, even when they have different backgrounds, different ideologies, whatever. That gives you a common ground because you're working on something. If you're not working on anything, it's easier for all this other shit that people argue about to get you distracted, because you don't really have a true common ground many a times.
Yeah, I guess the last thing I'm just thinking about is the difference between collective and collaborative, because sometimes every collaborative endeavor does not need to be collective. So we don't need everybody fucking feedback on everything, right? Collaboration could be like, you are putting your things together, which is different than something that is sort of collectively reached upon, right? So I think that both are important, but understanding the difference, like understanding what's a collaborative project and what's a collective project, can be really important, because everybody don't get a say in everything. Or if that is the goal, then making sure everybody is heard in the final product is based on that sort of shared vision, right? And so I just think that's just a little bit of a distinction too.
So for this week's planting thoughts, we have the Echeveria Elegans. Okay, so I'm gonna be real with y'all. I don't have a lot to say about this plant because it's new. So this plant is native to Mexico. It's also sometimes known as the Mexican rose. Now, what I will say about this is that this one is going to be a test for me, because I am not very good at succulents. And because it has been ugly here for a while. The last 2 or 3 days have been sunny. And so when I saw this at the farmer's market this weekend, I was like, ooh, that's pretty. Listen, we're going to check in a couple weeks about how long these buds last. I don't even know if the succulent itself is going to last very long. I personally tend to overwater succulents. Succulents tend to need a proper amount of neglect to thrive, and I tend to be a little bit too hands-on. But I will check back in with y'all about this one in a few weeks. So this one is the Echeveria Elegans, also known as the Mexican rose. This week we decided, because this episode will premiere at the beginning of March, we wanted to the month we do have a kind of theme. We have some women focused things over the course of the month, but as we kick off the month of March, we wanted to think specifically about women. And the role of radical Black women, obviously, because that's what we do. And we also thought it was nice to be able to bring other folks into the fold. CBS and I talk a lot about the politics of doing a podcast. CBS is indifferent a lot. Um,
Give us,
there's
us
a lot of
free.
there's a lot of background conversations that are just like, bring your ass, we're gonna keep doing this.
I'm indentured, y'all. It's sad.
But one of the things that she proposed was that we try to be in conversation more with other folks on the show. Obviously, we do the interviews, and even maybe some folks have noticed we've tried to start doing some of the interviews a little bit more conversationally as opposed to just straight Q&A. And so we were hoping to be able to have kind of a roundtable to just have folks bring people that they know, right? So a part of what we wanted to do today, excuse me, is feature some, some lightweight information about some of the Black radical women that each of us engage in our own thinking, in our political activism, in our work, and who we're inspired by, and just share that with folks. So obviously, whatever we offer today will just, scratch the surface, but it'll give you some more to go look at.
So like to add on to what Layla said, like this isn't an identitarian conversation. Like we're not talking about radical Black women just because they're radical Black women, but rather because they contributed to movements, to history, to knowledge production, to scholarship. But we tend not to know about them because of a wide range of things: the patriarchy, misogyny, sexism, along with intellectual McCarthyism. So even if you've heard of like a Kamala Harris, you're not going to have heard of many of the women we're going to talk about, or you won't have been exposed to them in depth because, when it's believe Black women, it's never believe Black women committed to liberation, right? So.
Yeah, no, I think that is a great point, and it feels extremely well, let me start off saying I'm honored to be here. I'm a big fan of the work both of you do. Sharice, you know how I feel about you. I can't stand you already know. But I think it feels super relevant right now, this conversation, because in the sort of superstructural world from or I guess the propaganda push right now is Black women assimilation, Black women luxury, Black women in the White House, Black women owning Supreme Court, Black women owning sports teams. And so to have this conversation, it feels very relevant as like kind of countercurrent to all of that. And so I'm really excited to dive in. And like you said, not necessarily have an identitarian conversation, but just to honestly to learn from the two of you as well.
Yeah, I can only echo Dev's sentiments. Like, I'm just happy to be here. I'm happy to be spending time like really sitting with people's lives and their ideas and their work and talk about the material impact of some folks' work on my life and my own work. And just vibe with y'all. So.
All right, y'all. So to kick off this roundtable discussion, this cipher, this grounding, we're going to start with the history of the president segment, which is where we take a historical quote, analyze it, and apply it to our present day. So Layla, can you talk about a little bit about this quote and why you chose it, and then kick it off?
For sure. So you all know that my research has been based in Venezuela. And when I first started spending time in Venezuela, I was in a region of the country known as Irote, which is so it's in the northeast of the Caracas area. It's on the Caribbean coast, but it is a region of the country that's known for having a high population of Afro descendants. And so when I started spending time there, I started hearing this woman's name, Echeveria. There's actually a university that was renamed after her during the time that I was spending there. I think that was around 2013 or 2014, maybe. And I'll talk a little bit more about who she is in the top 5 that are alive segment. But one of the things that you should just know about her is that she's a badass feminist, communist. She's all up in through the radical imagination of Venezuela as a figure. Her entire life she struggled. She was born to parents who were involved in struggle, and she died doing that. And so there is this book called Nuestra Causa, which basically is a compilation of her speeches and talks over the course of her lifetime. This particular what do you call it, quote that I'm pulling from comes from some of her public speeches during the 1970s. And so really what is important about Echeveria Elegans is that the work that she was doing was always trying to think about the triple oppression of poor Black women in the context of Venezuela, but also in sort of broader context. And so here she is articulating some of the specificities of what it's like to be a poor Black woman in Venezuela, but also why it's important for the communist and or socialist movements of Venezuela to think critically about the ways that Venezuelan women in general, but Black women in particular, are engaging. So it's a long quote, so I'm going to break it up into pieces, but I'll start with a smaller portion of it. So it begins by saying, Venezuelan women are a very important sector of the social forces that fight for a profound transformation of the current socioeconomic political system. It is completely clear that for the exploiters and oppressors, it is a matter of life and death to keep the women of popular classes deceived and marginalized from politics and guided by the path of a false sexual revolution as a path to women's liberation on a strictly individual level. The triple exploitation of women in the capitalist economy, in the family, and in society demands a scientific, particular, specific treatment of their problems, a policy and a direct message that can awaken them, make them aware of their situation, and capable of rebelling against the system. So here you see she comes out the bad with it, right? It's like she's like, this shit is bullshit. We need to be thinking about this from all angles. And and again, even to the point that you, Dev, made as we were introducing the segment, that we need to be thinking about we're not just talking about sort of these struggles as identitarian or even as individuals, right? We're thinking about this on a collective level. So I don't know if this first part of the quote sparks anything for any of you all.
Yeah, I mean, right from the jump where she says, and guided by the path of the false sexual revolution as a path to women's liberation on a strictly individual level. I mean, what year was this written, did you say?
But it's in the 70s, in the early 70s.
Okay, it feels like it could have been written yesterday, because I think right now, the sort of sexual politics of Black women and LGBTQ people's lives is like the dominant politic we talk about. And I think it's precisely because it's an extremely individualist angle to enter into, our lives essentially. And so right off the jump, that like stuck out to me. And I feel like, I don't know the context of when this was published, but I feel like she probably got ruffled some feathers and it probably was like, a hot moment.
Well, I will say, go ahead, Sylvia.
So putting on my political theorist hat, it's very interesting that she talks about triple exploitation, because I want to say the main framework of like LTP, Louise Thompson Patterson, who I'll talk about later, Claudia Jones and others, is triple oppression. And then at this time, if this is written in the 1970s, by that time, the Jeopardy language has risen. But the exploitation is important because she's talking about basically how surplus value is extracted in the capitalist economy, in the family, which is the unremunerated reproductive labor, and then in society. Whereas triple oppression is looking at the modes of domination that depend on Black women workers. So it's a different analytical framework, but obviously it's articulated to what Echeveria Elegans is talking about here. But it's just interesting that the triple permeates sort of all these different contexts. And so I go back and forth about, okay, using triple exploitation and triple oppression, and she offers a slightly different framework here. This is not fucking intersectionality. That's the main point. So
I also think it's the use of that triple exploitation terminology, and then specifically this mentioning capitalist economy, family, and society, it feels very much like a traditional, dare I say, orthodox Marxist analysis, in which the women's role, the nuclear family under capitalism, all of these things are being called into question in just two sentences. So I did just want to throw that out there. This feels this is the kind of shit I love, basically what I'm saying.
And it absolutely is in Arhelia Elias context. One, because even her father was a Marxist guerrilla fighter. And so that's what she was born into. But on top of that, I mean, I was going to share this during the top 5, but at 19, she was raped and impregnated and was shamed for that and lost her job as a teacher for that reason, was required to give that up, right? And so I think as much she did go to school, but she wasn't necessarily considered an intellectual in any kind in terms of her job. She was a teacher, but she didn't necessarily go like higher education, but she was a thinker, right? And so she was absolutely thinking with, I think, very like you said, very foundational Marxist thinking in a way that she's making sense of her own experiences, right? When I say poor, she was born quite poor, like very, very poor, right? And to have known what it was like to think about struggle as a poor person, as a woman, as a poor woman that lives in a region where people are particularly exploited by virtue of their racial identity, even as complicated as that is in some of these Latin American contexts, I think this is very much, it's very real for her in her everyday life.
And I think the first part of this quote really masterfully and like succinctly helps people develop like a vigilance to movement co-optation, right? So like, I think she's even pointing out that, using words like deceived and thinking about the path of the false sexual revolution, like even individual changes in folks' own lives that could, for them as an individual, be materially better. Like they could have a materially better life, could I don't know, be an illusion because the process of that transformation for an individual might produce a co-opted movement or a more vulnerability to exploitation from, as she puts here, exploiters and oppressors or a capitalist class.
And one other thing I just want to add about the context of Venezuela at this point, right? So this is also a point in time where Venezuela is still understood to be an exceptional democracy by the West. This is not the Venezuela that we know today, right? That is largely antagonistic. And so obviously when the West declares a formerly colonized country an exceptional democracy, it basically means they get in line, right? And so these struggles for socialism in the Venezuelan context in the 50s, 60s, and 70s against against dictators that are being run by the World Bank and the US and all these other structural adjustment programs. Like this is something that's actively being struggled against in this particular context. So I think it's also just important to know what's happening in Venezuela at the time, because she was growing up also under a dictator. So the second part of the quote says, the first step to the true liberation of women is socialism. Equal rights for the masses of women is only possible in a truly socialist society. The full realization of socialism demands the complete liberation of women. It is necessary to awaken, unite, and organize women to fight for their emancipation and socialism. Women are almost absent from the ranks challenging the capitalist system, and it is evident that they do not yet perceive the redemptive message of socialism. This is a real weakness of the revolutionary movement that must be overcome by the development of two parallel lines. What does that one do for you all?
So what I just quickly, I'll say, like, what's really important here is the priority, number one, historical materialism, but two, also the priority of the economic. And this is not economic determinism, but it really, again, it's relevant to today because it's a critique of not only individualism, but also the sort of girl boss shit, right? Where it's like ascending in a capitalist system is not liberation for women. And so the complete transformation of society, especially along the lines of political economy, is the basis for women's equality. And again, not in a reductive way. It's not additive. It's not as if women's liberation is secondary, but that the economic is absolutely important, which means also expropriating some of your fucking faves, right? And so I think that really stood out to me in this particular portion.
Well, and I think not even just economically. I mean, I think we all understand in order to institute socialism, you have to institute an entire societal shift, right? And so I think that along with this sort of economic shift, she's also getting at this idea that even the ways that we know women and we think about women and all these things, they can't change until the material base first changes. Because if you have a system that's inherently exploitative and gendered, and inherently gendered as well, how can women's liberation take place within that system? And I think we see examples of that, like Sharice, you just said, the girl bossing. We see examples of what the alternative looks like. But I'm also thinking a lot about Cuba, and where they have like a representative government where I believe it's 50% women at the moment, or 51%, one of the two. But that was something that they had to work hard for and struggle over many decades, right? Just because there was like a socialist revolution doesn't mean you wake up the next morning and everything's better. And it's still not perfect in the way, but so that's kind of what comes to mind a lot. And for me, I can remember back when I was more on my sort of radical liberal days, and I didn't know the difference between an individual struggle and a collective struggle, and didn't think I needed to know a difference. And so I would be talking about immigration, women's issues, LGBTQ, and I would almost divorce it from the fact that what we all have in common with our different identities is like the same system that is oppressing us. And if we can, from that point, organize, then we can have a much more stronger and collective movement. And so that's really what I'm feeling paralleled and hearing from her in this quote, for sure.
Yeah, like there's simultaneously obviously a critique of capitalism here, but a critique of even socialist movements that don't, I mean, her words explicitly, women are almost absent from the ranks, challenging the capitalist system. So really engaging, like, what does transformation really mean? Like, how are some of these movements, even reifying or making more concrete status quo of gender exploitation and gender relationships? Like, what does it mean to think beyond participation and like sort of filling seats or a check mark on a list, and really thinking about transformed relationships? But
I was also I think Darian, to the same point that you're pulling out there, I'm also thinking about her. This is the call to organize women, right? Like it's in particular saying, okay, this is not just about us having a sort of abstract conversation about how these things impact women, but where are women actually in these struggles? And it's funny because it's making me, because I'm thinking about, this is around the same time period, it's making me think about a piece that I had shared on Twitter recently, I think maybe a week or two ago, of Samora Michelle, who's actually thinking about the role and the place of women, and the way that women can actually be engaged politically to reimagine their own positioning, and that it actually has to happen in struggle, right? This is not just about conversations, and it does matter on these sort of what would you call it, more intimate levels, right, in the sort of family structures, but there's also an extrapolation I think is happening from what it looks like on a daily basis in these sort of nuclear familial structures, and how that then continues to play out at regional levels, at the national level and beyond. And so I think here, for me, what's also important here is that I think there's a very explicit call to not just talk about women, but for women themselves to take up their own role in what this means, and to be thinkers and doers in this struggle, right? To figure out, to be a part of the process.
Exactly. Let me just add here, though, it's not just a critique of men or patriarchy, right? What she's saying is that for women, they do not yet perceive the redemptive message of socialism. So it's a responsibility for women as well, right? So it's like, hey, y'all, if we're gonna be, if it is that the future is female, we got to be doing this shit. We have to understand socialism too, right? And so I just wanted to throw that out there.
And to be
Well,
quite transparent, she was a guerrilla fighter, so she's also for women picking up arms too.
Period.
well, I mean,
I'm strapped right now.
and on that tip, I really implore listeners to go and look into the ECLN or the Zapatista movement and how the women function in Chiapas at large, but especially in the Zapatista movement. And a recent example is they actually did an international women's conference. Layla, you're probably familiar with it already, I assume. And they had women from all around the world who came and met with them for several days. And they told the men of the town basically, we want you to do this, this, and this. You're gonna cook. You're gonna be security. You're gonna go pick these people up from the airport. Like they have developed their society in such a way that there's no it's almost like there's no like critical issue or critical contradiction in elevating them to the role they want to be or need to be in certain times. And so it's almost like here we have like a divisive hurdle to overcome, and they're operating from a space of having already had this struggle for so many years. And so when you read and learn about how women function in Zapatista society, it can, especially for people coming from the US, which I feel like is the most sexist nation ever, it can be kind of mind-blowing, but it really opens up the imagination for what these struggles can really actually look like.
But I also just want to add, I think something that's important, even in that scenario where women are telling men that they have to do certain things. Sharice and I were having this conversation last week, right? So for me, I won't speak for anybody else. The goal is not to replace patriarchy with matriarchy, right? But it is for in societies where men have done certain work and women have done other work, and the work that women do is devalued. It is important for men to understand the nature of what that work is and the difficulty and the skill and all of those things that it requires, and also what it then means to free up some of women's labor to do other things, right? So to share the burden. And so I think, because I think sometimes it can be misinterpreted when they say, oh, women are telling men what to do, that it's just about a reversal of power. And that's not what's happening. It is actually about an attempt to understand on a different level, because Thomas Sankara did the same thing in Burkina Faso. It was like, nah, y'all gonna cook, y'all gonna go to market, y'all gonna buy food, and you're gonna see what that requires and what that's like organizationally.
And you have to also understand when a society has a transformed understanding of labor, and they don't necessarily view labor on such a rigid hierarchical level, there's an importance to all facets of labor and different forms of labor. And to fully understand the importance, the experience, and all these things, you do have to have the experience. And experience is like a ubiquitous term nowadays, but there's Zapatista has written about this, that essentially, especially in the Latin American context and in where they are of all places, but there's so many sort of centuries at this point of this colonial gender relations, and to repeal that, you have to directly confront it, right? And so, yeah, I think I agree 100%. It's not just about role reversal and replacing a patriarch with a matriarch, et cetera, but it's about understanding that this labor should be of equal value. It should not be devalued. And should you have to do this labor, fill in for this position, or this is your position, there's nothing wrong with that.
I mean, I think at the same time, there are spiritual aspects to particular types of work or of particular functions that differently gendered bodies, and not just the binary, but that differently gendered bodies do. And so what sexism and what patriarchy does is it turns particular work into drudgery, but then the liberal flip side to that is that everybody should just do everything. Well, no, the point is to not devalorize particular types of labor and particular types of work. And if it is that a gendered body does particular types of work, that's not objectively sexism, patriarchy, whatever. There might be a spiritual or a sort of cultural component to that, but it's to not devalorize, right? To not devalorize or to sublate that work because it's done by that particularly gendered body too. So again, it's not just this replacement, reversal, just put everything in a fucking box and shake it up and everybody does whatever. It's the value, like the literal value, but also the sort of social value we place on things as well. So it's really about the transformation of the ethical and the value and cultural system, as well as like the material. Yeah. Anyway.
I think this also, what you just said, like kind of increases just the general population's political education, level of political education, like sort of political literacy, right? So just even different jobs within the same community or the same organization offers a variety of perspectives about how people relate, about how wealth is created, how it's distributed, the skill sets that people have to develop. And I think just on a practical kind of everyday level, that can engender a certain I don't know, just like certain modes of political education, maybe outside of what we might normally think in terms of like reading circles or classroom settings, or sort of engaging textual theory. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, so in the quote, she goes on to say, on the one hand, the need to deepen the knowledge of the situation of women in capitalist Venezuela, which is dependent and underdeveloped, and thus to advance the ideological discussion of how the Venezuelan road to socialism will equalize women with men, of how Venezuelan socialism will dignify the female sector of the population and in their human rights. On the other hand, together with the theoretical treatment of this vital problem to achieve the deep and definitive transformation of the structures of the country, establish a mass line and new organizational forms that facilitate the active incorporation of women into the struggle for their rights and for socialism. In the wave that shakes the people of today, the struggle of women for their liberation appears as something new and confusing. Even the majority of men do not understand it and perhaps even fear it. Neither do most women. It is the expression of the conservative attitude that impedes the advancement of humanity. Whoever seeks a profound change of the unjust structures that plunge human beings into unhappiness, it is time to assume a positive change of attitude towards women. I mean, she just keeps going in and in and in.
I think just right off the bat, I just love anytime someone like so clearly makes the case that our fates are tied, that this is not an identitarian sort of like, oh, this is a pet issue or a population of people that is distinct from like a normed, or like from, you know, the fate of men, even of quote unquote revolutionary men, but like we're all in this. The stakes are very high for all of us. And so I really like how she put these words together here.
This point has already been raised before, but I think that she's very clear about the fact that most people don't understand the necessity for freedom in the way that it is being articulated through a movement towards socialism, right? And she's saying that, you know, as much as the men don't understand it, the vast majority of women don't either, right? And I think again, this is important because I think something Kwame Ture used to always say: people who are oppressed know they are oppressed, right? You know how it feels. You don't necessarily understand the particularities of the structures that do the oppressing. You don't necessarily understand how it's working, and you don't always understand how to get out from under it. And I think that there's something there. I guess something about her that speaks to me is that because she's a teacher, right? She's always thinking about that, right? Like that's our role. It's our responsibility. And teaching is as much about, you know, the ways that we sort of theorize our situations, and to just be able to say, like, to be able to make these connections, to be able to make these important connections, and to know that as much work as we're doing, we still have so far to go with so many people, right? And I think that I hear that resonating in what she's saying there.
I think it's also important to point out that she says, together with theoretical treatment of this vital problem, they can achieve deep and transformative structures and establish a new mass line, new organizational forms, And so she very much marries the theoretical to the, you know, to action, right? She's very much like, you can't have one without the other. She's talking about transforming minds and transforming society and organizing in the same breath. You know what I mean? And so I think it's very important, because you know, you have to have theory behind your action. You can't just go out there and do random stuff. And she's echoed that a few times already, but I just find it fascinating because so many people today get very stuck, or glued to the theory side of things and the theoretical and ideological and ontological and all those other multiple syllable words. And she's like, she's fighting against that. You know what I mean? And she's actively saying you can't do one without the other. If not, it's almost useless, you know?
This is the second to last chunk from this quote. For the Venezuelan socialist movement, it is imperative to be inescapable. It must not abandon the responsibility of leading half of the population in a just struggle of the most oppressed sector within the system at the risk of failure. It is necessary to understand now that the problems of the women's sector are not only women's problems or feminist problems. The battle for liberation of women is a very important feature of the struggle for the liberation of humanity, of the struggle for socialism. The day is not far off when Venezuelan women will have to rebel against the dependent capitalism that oppresses our homeland and against the machismo that denies equal rights to half of our people. And I will say, one of the things that Chavez, as when he became president, became known for, is to say to be socialist is to be feminist, right? In this context, and that's something that she always said. And I don't know explicitly if he got that from her, but I do think there is a thread through the party, because she was a member of the movement towards socialism and later the feminist movement. And so I think that there is constantly a push to think about feminism in the Venezuelan context, to think about feminism within the context of socialism, right? And not just you know, as she said, this sort of individual struggles to, I don't know, wear pants and work outside of the home and do other types of things, right? It's a particular struggle to understand the nature of the exploitation and oppression of women.
Yeah, I think the Venezuelan context is very important here, because I understand, and because and the contextual, historical, and material realities, right? It makes sense why Chavez would say to be socialist, to be feminist. That is not the case in the United States. To be feminist is to be fucking feminist, and to be socialist is to be a liberal here. So, right. And so I just am very weary about that. I know I give feminism a hard time. It is mostly US based articulations of feminism. I'm much more sympathetic to, or much more sort of, I resonate much more with Caribbean types of feminisms that come out of a society that takes seriously feminism as, or like women's liberation as foundational to economic liberation, to socialist transformation. And even people who don't get all the way to socialist transformation, at least to the fundamental reconstitution of society, whereby value isn't extracted from women in the public and private sector in ways that expend a lot of resources in upholding that system, right? And that's not, and I think that that's sort of endemic in particular types of Caribbean and third world feminisms in ways that is just not in the US. And it's such a girl boss, rooting for everybody, black luxury, as Dev mentioned earlier. That is just such the root of feminism, even intersectional feminism, even Black feminism, especially as it emanates from like academia and then permeates activism and organizing circles. It just is still very much entrapped in a capitalist, like a benevolent capitalist logic that I just can't get jiggy with that shit. So, you know, and then at some point, you know, we could bring womanism into the, I've always resonated more with like Africana womanism for whatever reason. They're sort of whatever. There's some baked in contradictions there too, but I just want to emphasize that this particular enunciation of feminism is important, is not, it's not transferable necessarily, right? What it's meant in this context is not necessarily what is meant in the US context. So,
well, I think I always say this about representation, right? Like the concept of representation in the US in a capitalist, colonial, imperialist state means something different than when you say representation in Cuba or when you say representation in Venezuela, right? Like the mere material implications of what you're speaking about in the context of Cuba, they're talking about they have racial and gender and neighborhood representation at all levels of the state, right? And they have a representative system through which they can materially engage. They're not speaking about individual icons they can pick up and look at on a billboard, right? And same thing in Venezuela, same thing in Bolivia. When we think about the indigenous struggles, catapulting indigenous women to the national platform, not just as sort of face cards, but actually with power in a sort of representative socialist way. And so feminism, I feel, is no different. Anytime you're speaking of a concept within the capitalist context, the ground on which you're standing is different than the ground on which someone else is standing. So you have to account for the soil that's underneath your feet, you know what I mean? And here, the soil underneath your feet is capitalist academia and corporations and et cetera, and girl boss isms, and consumerism. I mean, feminism here is largely consumerism at this point, right? Like, you have to buy certain things. If you don't buy Ivy Park, you hate Black women, or like, you know what I mean? Like, so you don't have an equivalent of that hardly anywhere else. Like, we are in the house of imperialist consumerism here. You don't really have many equivalents to that. I mean, I can think of some examples, but the way that consumerism is weaved into feminism here, both from an academic level, from an organizing level, for sort of popular mainstream feminisms. And that doesn't mean there's not countercurrents to that, and there's people who are doing great work, and I don't want to discredit that. But I'm just saying, you always have to think about the terrain on which it's taking place.
Well, while we're accounting for the soil underneath our feet, I want to ask y'all who have more working experience in Latin American contexts, about use of the word machismo, because she says here, right, the machismo that denies equal rights to half our people. And on my ears, I think like my brain just kind of reads that word and thinks about patriarchy generally, but I don't actually know sort of the exact sentiment that is being, and the exact dynamic that's being described, that might be very, very specific to a Venezuelan context versus, someone just using the word patriarchy elsewhere. So I don't know if y'all want to speak on that, but.
I mean, I think so. Also, you're in this context, in this time period, you're also talking about women who essentially live as peasants, right? And when I say peasant, like they are living rural lives, right? And so when you're living rural lives and the type of labor that you do to take care of the family is backbreaking daily labor, that often still comes with a mate or a partner who might be physically abusive. Again, in the case of Ayala, like she was raped and then told to abandon that child, and when she chose not to abandon that child, lost her job, right? And so even when she's thinking about machismo, she's even thinking about what it means to be in a woman's body, to have the burden of carrying a child that for whatever reason she doesn't want to give up. That could have been religious, it could have been any other kinds of things, but then to be told that a decision that you did not make about your body now disqualifies you from continuing to do the work to take care of yourself, right? And so I think these are all the types of things. And so, I mean, I think there's obviously an articulation of patriarchy there. I also think there's something about the kind of interpersonal dynamics too that's being explained through machismo.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's like the interpersonal expression of the structural realities of patriarchy. So like attitudes, behaviors, like the quotidian of patriarchy.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I always say like machismo is it's like a pattern of behavior. It's like a direct descendant of replicating of basic colonial structures and sort of gendered relationships. Um, Inside of talking about machismo, there's kind of already like a discussion of patriarchy laden in there already. And I'm sure most Latin American, like third world feminist thinkers have articulated that incredibly. But when we think about machismo, it's sort of like I don't like saying like the day to day, but because it does form like a structure of behaviors, if that makes sense. And so, but it informs everything from like the lowest level to the higher level in Latin America, particularly just because there's like a very specific history emanating from like colonialism. Although I would not, I mean, we have basically, we just don't call it the same thing here, but we have similar, you know, gender relation issues here as well. We just don't call it machismo.
I think people in our context, people mislabeled it hypermasculinity.
I was gonna say, I think it's
yeah,
100%. Hypermasculinity and or toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
I think is how it would
yeah.
be.
Well, I think there's a and I was going to talk about this later, but there's a essay from Safia Bukhari who she talks about gender relations and sexism and the Black Panther Party, and she talks so machismo is like an aggressive masculinity is a good way to describe it, right? It's like almost like a performance of masculinity to an extent, but Safia Bukhari talks about like an aggressive femininity and a sort of weaponization of femininity. And so machismo is very much in that similar vein. It's almost like a weaponization of masculinity, but it's normalized and it's accepted and it's a day-to-day. So it's not, maybe not like a conscious decision per se that it's going to be.
Yeah, it's that thing that says, yeah, all of my brothers get to go play while I have to wash clothes and cook and iron and do all this other shit, and they just get to go be little boys and go play.
Yeah. And from that you can see how from that emanates homophobia or transphobia as well, because any derision from this, you know, machismo sort of you know, cis heterosexual, in most cases Christian context, any deviation from that is sort of like an attack to the actual machismo structure itself for individuals.
Absolutely. So let's wrap this part of the conversation up. So she ends with this. It must be made absolutely clear the active incorporation of women into politics and their adherence to the cause of socialism must be the product of intense ideological work combined with combative and persevering action in the search for solutions to everyday problems. Socialists must create the political and organizational conditions necessary for the effective incorporation of women into the political process. And in particular, they must facilitate the participation of the women of their families in the struggle for socialism. Within the socialist forces, machismo is a reflection of the machismo of society, an ally of dependent capitalism. This is a burden that must be overcome in order to successfully achieve the victory of socialism and the eradication of machismo in Venezuelan society. So here, even in this, I think she's even making an extension and understanding machismo to be a particular performance of masculinity under capitalism, right? And so that it is necessary to undo these things together. And also, you know, one of the ways that I think she's also being very explicit about what she means when she says political, right? Because political for her is again this movement towards socialism, and that it is a process. And I think that that's something that I really appreciate about the way the political is understood in the Venezuelan context. They often talk about it as the process, right? That it's always ongoing. It's always something to be done and undone, to be made and remade. And that, you know, I think is really interesting to think about the political in these, because when she says that we must be in search for solutions to everyday problems, right? Like she is thinking very much about what it means to live life on a daily basis, right? And that we can have these sort of macro conversations at the nation state level and beyond, but we're also talking about people and how they live and how they get to be human every day, and how for her understanding is that the system of capitalism disallows that, and it is facilitated through processes like or engagement with machismo, and that the only way to then undo that is to engage in the way that she understands feminism, which is a part of the goal towards socialism.
Yes, she's also saying, it seems to me, that a socialism that continues machismo is not like really socialism, because it's carrying on with a sort of contradiction that is a reflection of capitalist society, right? And two, it reminds me of like why we say like racial capitalism, that you have to struggle against racism and the sort of anti-blackness, but also like the sort of the racialized foundations of capitalism to really overthrow it. And likewise, you have to struggle against machismo, the everyday or the sort of interpersonal actualization of patriarchy, to get at a real socialism. You can't understand socialism as this like patriarchal or machistic, I don't know, like struggle for against capitalism. Like that's just about like taking up arms and overthrowing the state. That it reminds me of Cabral too. Like you have to rethink like fundamentally how you relate to women, right? How women relate to other women, how women relate to men, to be able to actually transform society. That these things have to happen simultaneously, and that one without the other is incomplete. So you can, if you're only challenging machismo and not challenging capitalism, that's an incomplete struggle, and vice versa.
I also feel that it's important to keep in mind that sexism or patriarchy, it is an exploitative process, isn't it? Right. So one example I like to use is I know someone who runs a caregiving business. They provide care to elderly people or people with disabilities. And what they do is they get informal caregivers, like usually it's girlfriends, wives, sisters, mothers, friends who are women. That's typically how it goes. And they get them certified and signed on to work as caregivers. And when I learned about that, I instantly realized that means there's thousands, if not millions, of women across the country who are doing caregiving labor for free. A labor which quite literally helps hold up society in many ways, right? And you can put the same context, into the kitchen in your home growing up. If your mother was in there cooking, cleaning, slaving 7 days a week, right? And so thinking about issues of gender as well as sexuality to an extent, in terms of exploitation, allows us to see once again the common enemy is the capitalist system, right? And the colonial derivatives of that. And so I think that she keeps that in mind the entire time she's talking. Like she calls machismo an ally of dependent capitalism, right? And so she's saying you're not a socialist if you're still sexist or you're endeavoring in machismo, because that means you're still actually actively exploiting us in some way. And I just think that distinction she makes is really important.
I also think she is really effective here at keeping the movement going, or articulating how to continue to enlist people in struggle and bring people together, right? Like going back to, the start of this quote, when she talks about exploitation in the capitalist economy, in the family, and in society, like, okay, this is not a specialized, like struggle is not sort of segmented off to people who are maybe like holding official positions in a revolutionary organization or a political party. They are included, or just people who are engaged in like wage labor or other forms of labor, but also it's incumbent on you to be reflective about your own families and the company you keep and the household that you are a part of, and making the conditions, making it possible for, she said here, like the women of their families, enabling their participation in the struggle for socialism. So it's an invitation, it's a call, and it requires everybody, even if they're not, like in sort of a cliched kind of role or realm for struggle, that there's room for everybody to do this work.
I think it's also this notion, Darren, and you've hit on it a few times, is like, it's not like over here, when women get free, we're gonna move to the gays. When the gays get free, we're gonna move to the immigrants. When the immigrants get free, like it's not, these identities intersect and overlap and are complicated and are messy and are all present in all spaces at all times. Like there's no way to strictly and solely liberate women and not think about the society at large, because women permeate every single aspect of society. And you see what I'm saying? So it's like, it's not even it's like anti-sectarian almost in that way. There's people who, they only want to focus on the gays, or they only want to focus on the Black gays in Atlanta, or I don't know, very specific communities. And honestly, like, shouts out to them, do your work, it's cool. But at the same time, that's literally just not how the material world around us works. Like, that's not, I don't go to work and pass a community on the way that is just all 100% women in there, and I need that specific all women community to get free. Like, no, we're all living lives that cross each other every day, and we have families, we have coworkers, we have people in the struggle with us of any and all identity and community. So it literally, you have to grapple with the material world around you, and that's what she's saying. She's like, you have to look around you. There's some real shit around you that you can touch and you can feel, and you have to work from that point.
And I think that's so interesting about that's part of what's interesting about her as a figure, because she gets taken up as a figure by the Afro-descendant communities in a particular way, and by the feminist communities in a particular way, and by the, and by the socialists in a particular way, right? And for her, like, she's like, I'm all of these things all the time, right? And that I'm always struggling on all these fronts. And there is a lot of I don't kind of, these kind of proprietary disputes over her legacy and, who she did work for. But I will say her legacy as a Black woman is probably the most obscured, right? As a woman and as a feminist, as a socialist, she gets taken up. But Venezuela, Latin America has, its own particular troubles with dealing with Blackness in that way. And that is something that she was very, unapologetically clear about. I am a Black woman, right? But that, I think that is interesting to think about how she is so intentional about carrying all of those together all the time in the work that she does. So I think that was quite a robust conversation. And I think unless there are any final thoughts, we can wrap this part of the conversation up.
All right, y'all. So I got a short and sweet rant this week. Well, they're never sweet, a short and sour rant this week, but check your fucking Eurocentrism. Even when wars are happening in Europe, they're affecting so many places, like Africa, like the Caribbean, like the Middle East, right? And so when you only care about shit that affects Europe, that's Eurocentrism. Even if you're trying to make an argument about Black people, if you're only tuning in to some shit that is happening in Europe, i.e. this Ukraine conflict, you're reproducing Eurocentrism and you're reproducing white supremacy. Stop doing that shit. Because the US is bombing Somalia, it's bombing Yemen, there's bombs that are falling in Palestine that are US funded. This shit is happening everywhere and all the time. So stop falling for the State Department bullshit and only caring about what they care about. Europe is not the fucking world, right? We need to provincialize Europe and provincialize the idea that when things happen there, they're only happening there, right? But also to think about when violence is happening in other parts of the world, that shit matters too. Haiti matters. The Democratic Republic of the Congo matters. Mali matters. All of Libya, all of these things matter. And so when we say, fuck NATO, fuck the EU, fuck the United States, and fuck that whole axis of domination, we're saying that to lift up the fact that violence is happening everywhere and all the time, whether it's through direct military engagement or through sanctions or through occupation. We need to care about that shit all the time, not only when the white folks get sad because people who look like them are being brutalized. So check your fucking Eurocentrism. Thanks.
All right, y'all. So before we get out of here, we just wanted to remind you all that CBS and I are doing a conversation with Monthly Review Press where we'll be reading, actually more like a work study circle, we'll be reading Consciencism. So stay tuned for that. That is going to be happening on Sunday, March 13th. We'll give you more details about how to register and everything in the coming weeks. Okay, so before we get out of here, also remember to stay tuned for the second part of this very special episode where we are talking about Black radical women. The next part 2 will feature our top 5 that are alive Black radical women. And that's our show for this Friday evening. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you chose to be here with us. So thanks for tuning in. I'm Dr. Layla Brown here with my girl, Dr. CBS. Thanks as always to Two Black in the Back. And we're signing off. See you next time.
Arigato.